What does the sale of Venezuelan oil in currencies other than the US dollar mean? From Telesur TV website, Spanish original version by Misión Verdad, the Mission Truth Mission, September 16th, 2017. De-dollarization by the Eurasian Union would throw the West into crisis, especially when Europe is racked by banking crisis. The Venezuelan oil market now has the chance of trading future oil contracts offered by China denominated in Yuan, their currency. The petrodollar is more important for U.S. global denomination than either arms exports or Hollywood culture because it allows the U.S. to be the biggest exporter of the dollar bills the rest of the world has, which needs to be able to buy oil. Venezuela has decided to start de-dollarizing its economy. To understand what this means, it's necessary to look at the geopolitical context in which the move takes place. After President Nicolás Maduro announced last Thursday that every business signing contracts with the Venezuelan state should do so in a foreign currency other than the US dollar, Vice President Tarek El-Assiami sought to ensure the country's productive sector gets the necessary mechanisms via public and private banks to be able to migrate to a new basket of foreign currencies. In a working meeting with business people on the Constituent Plan for Peace and Economic Prosperity, Aissami said, "We have to throw off the yoke of the dollar," arguing that anyone wanting to bid in auctions of the floating exchange rate system, DICOM, should switch their bank accounts to another currency. Aissami added, We're doing no more auctions in dollars. Those auctions are over." He emphasized that these measures are meant to counteract economic sanctions imposed by the U.S. Aissami also said that Venezuelan citizens promoting the sanctions would face trial, adding that Venezuela is closing existing bank accounts and migrating them to other banks around the world, whom he thanked for their assistance, and he reported that, quote, "In the public banking system we already have partner banks in all of those countries," end of quote, Russia, China, India, Europe. What does the petrodollar rule? Why? The US dollar became the predominant currency for international payments because until the middle of the 20th century, the gold standard was the dominant monetary system. This system was based on the fixed quantity of gold reserves stored in national banks, which set a limit on possible credit. At that historical moment, the U.S. government managed to appropriate 70% of the world's gold except that of the Soviet Union, thus weakening Britain and bypassing the Bretton Woods financial system set up in 1944, which ended in 1972, if I remember. We went off the currency exchange of the dollar that was pegged to the price of gold, but never backed by gold, just pegged to the price of gold fluctuation. It was known as Bretton Woods. I remember that from school. To reach its long-desired world dominance, the U.S. government used two main tools, the U.S. dollar and its military power. Some countries developed alternative military alliances and broke with dependency on the U.S. dollar to avoid being subjugated. In the 1970s, the U.S. dollar suffered a dramatic fall due to the economic growth of Germany and Japan and the reluctance of the U.S. authorities to adjust economic policy to maintain a balance between the U.S. dollar and gold. The U.S. currency was revived with help from oil exporters like Saudi Arabia, who exchanged their oil for U.S. armaments. In 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon unilaterally cut a convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold, the so-called Nixon shock, and so oil became the basis of the U.S. dollar system, and for that reason, keeping control of oil trading is today a priority of U.S. foreign policy. So long as the members of the OPEC supported this system, world demand for U.S. petrodollars reached historic high, and countries were obliged to buy dollars in order to purchase oil on the international markets. Currently, the U.S. contribution to the global GDP is calculated at no more than 22%, but 80% of international payments are made in U.S. dollars, making the dollar overvalued in comparison with other currencies. That's why the U.S. consumers can buy imported goods at extremely low prices, giving them significant financial advantage, while high demand for dollars in the rest of the world allows the U.S. government to refinance its debt at very low interest rates. The threat of de-dollarization. Any country fighting against the dollar is considered to be a direct threat to the U.S. economic hegemony and its citizens' high standard of living, which means the U.S. elites do whatever it takes to defeat resistance. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was brutally murdered when he decided to sell oil in euros and then replaced the euro by introducing the gold dinar currency. That meant the emergence of a national leader with 150 tons of gold reserves proposing to sell oil in exchange for real gold, which is why then French President Nicolas Sarkozy said Libya is putting at risk the global financial stability. which is based on an unsupported currency of benefit only to U.S. consumers. Along with some banks and energy companies operating in their countries, China, Russia, and Iran are following a de-dollarization policy to escape U.S. denomination. In 2014, the Russian Treasury announced a plan to increase their participation of ruble-based contracts, while last May, at the Shanghai summit, Russia committed to selling China $400 billion of natural gas over the next 30 years, invoiced in rubles and the yuan. It has been called the deal of the century. During his visit to China last August, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the petrodollar system should be a thing of the past. Given the Western sanctions policy against his country, he added, Russia is discussing the use of national currencies and swap agreements with various countries. Over the last few months, China has signed currency swap agreements with Canada and Qatar, thus making Canada the first offshore center for these Chinese yuan in North America, while doubling or even tripling trade with China by as much as an estimated 200 RMBs. The currency swap between China and Qatar itself, recently the target of sanctions, are equivalent to $5.7 billion US dollars, turning Qatar into the base for the yuan in the Middle East. Markets already suspicious of the US dollar because it exports inflation. It may only be a matter of time before other OPEC countries sign currency swap agreements with China. China has also promoted establishing a compensation center in Malaysia's capital, Kuala Lumpur, to encourage greater use of the yuan in Southeast Asia. It is within less than a month of Singapore, Asia's biggest financial center, becoming an exchange center for the yuan via the currency swap for Singapore dollars. Iran has also recently announced its reluctance to use dollars for foreign trade. Kazakhstan's president Nursultan Nazarbayev has likewise instructed his country's national bank to de-dollarize the economy. The United Kingdom plans to issue debt in yuan, while the European Central Bank is discussing whether to include yuan in its official reserves. While the real world's tendency grows along with domestic U.S. inflation, so too does anti-Russian propaganda. In terms of resources, whoever has the gold or oil underground is able to decide geopolitical issues or currency hegemony. However, military power is also a determining factor in the readjustment of leadership currently taking place with the collapse of the capitalist system. Presidents George Bush and Barack Obama used up the state's reserves and plundered Social Security, among other things, to finance the war on terror, increasing spending in other departments. Even though Russia, through its Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, has recognized that the U.S. has waged a large-scale economic war against it, Russia's debt is now in comparison with European countries. Russia's growth before 2011 was greater than that of the United States, Germany, France, or Japan, and the rest of the G8 countries. Vladimir Putin paid off almost all of Russia's debt, selling hydrocarbons during the period when prices were high. The Venezuelan oil market has now the chance of trading so-called future oil contracts offered by China, denominated in yuan. Both oil and gas exporters like Russia, Iran, Qatar, and Venezuela could avoid dollar trades if their buyers could pay for oil in yuan, or even in gold after converting their yuan into gold ounces. According to Michael Snyder in his blog, The Economic Collapse, in economic and financial terms, China's government has been playing chess while the West has been playing checkers. Unfortunately for the U.S., play has now reached a stage where checkmate is within view. Venezuela is positioning itself to preserve its peaceful sovereignty and self-determination at a moment of geopolitical reconfiguration that will decide the world's economic course for decades to come. All right, folks, if you were watching this last year, I believe it was, in Switzerland, the world has what's called SDR, Specific Deposit Reserve Currencies, and there were 4 in the world, of which the dollar was the main petrodollar. They announced last year a 5th Specific Deposit Reserve Currency that they back with gold, which is the Chinese yuan. And the woman who was the chairman, when she announced the new SDR currency, the 5th one in the world, and they asked her why they did that, and she said it was to hedge against risk of the dollar, which means they know the dollar is going to collapse. So look out, folks. You might want to look into buying more gold, Bitcoin, or Chinese money, or any other currency than the dollar, because what if it starts falling? If it's not the petrodollar, if it's only producing 22% of world GDP, but it's 80% of the trade in cash, then it's overvalued by 75%. It could fall as much as 75, 80%. So watch out. Thanks for tuning in to the Plain Mundane Show. I'm Alex Aquarius.